I'm calling this talk Islam and Modernity. Modernity is Challenge. And I'm going to be speaking about several of the reactions of Muslims in the modern period, which I take to be 18th century to the present, to European colonization and the after effects of European colonization. And just to, the sort of take home point is that unlike in the classical period, it's really no longer, in the modern period, partly as a consequence of first colonization and second globalization, it's really impossible to talk about Islam, Islamic lands, the Middle East in isolation. What we really need to think about are these regions and this constellation in a dynamic, dynamic and changing relationship with the European and powers first and second, the United States, and other regions, China. In other words, once we get into the modern period, it's no longer really sensible to talk about it. Well, in my humble opinion, it's no longer sensible to talk about Islam and the West like it really was in the classical period, when things were quite when the nature of the interactions were more remote. In this period, really, Islam is defining itself in response and reaction and in a kind of relationship with its colonizers, at least the international, the most impactful Islamic statements on these. So, really, the course, there's really an abrupt rupture leading into the modern period, and that's got to be the starting point for understanding it. So I tend to think the attempts in most times and places to link the modern period and things like, and in these both liberal movements and jihadist movements, and link them to the distant past, I tend to not be terribly convinced by. I think the modern period does represent a shift and has to be understood with pretty separate, in separate terms. In the modern period, it's useful to distinguish between Islamism and what I'll call everyday Islam. Everyday Islam, I'm just calling, let's keep in mind, if you're born in a region where the country is Muslim, you're born a Muslim, just as you were born, many of you were born in whatever faith community you were born in, and born in the United States with all of its presuppositions. And so most people, I just have to, I think most of you are aware of this, but I just want to remind you, most people, religion is a matter of course that they grow up with. It's not something that's kind of on their minds, just as being an American citizen is not exactly on your minds. It's just something you take for granted. So too with Muslims in the Islamic world, or many Muslims. However, what I'm speaking about in this talk is not the majority of people, but those who are, for one reason or another, invested in reformulating or in formulating what Islam is, or who are making their religious commitment, let's say the formulation of their religious commitment in the modern period, something that's articulate. And those I'm going to refer to, the people who are doing that, I'm going to refer to as Islamists, as opposed to sort of your everyday Muslims. So really what this talk is about is Islamists and modernity, just to put a fine point on it. So we can really talk about two phases of modernity as distinct. And first is the European colonization from the early 19th, late 18th, early 19th centuries to the mid 20th century. And I just want to pause on that for a second. I know for some of you, the mid 20th century feels like a long time ago because you were quite young, but we're talking about all the way to, the war in Algeria, all the way to the late 1960s, early 1970s. So the European experiment with having colonies in the Middle East, North Africa, Islamic region is a long one, a long and sad and quite violent one. And again, it's impossible to emphasize its long-term impact. And all of the American ventures in the last 20 years from the point of view of the Middle East, have to be seen in that light as a continuation. Or at least let's just say they are seen as a continuation of the of um, Western powers, for one reason or another, engaging with them, for their own purposes. And we're going to look at some of the discourse by Napoleon, and you're going to see it's got amazing resonance in terms of for I should just say similarities to some of the discourse used by Americans in the late 20th, early 21st century in their engagements with the Middle East, wars in the Middle East. And part two we could take is late 20th century to the present, which is globalization, which is the phase we're in now. When we think about some of the ideals of the modern period, uh, in the first of all, they're formulated in Europe and to some degree in the United States. So this is coming. In other words, there's one just to point out, which I think something that's easy to take for granted. The modern period is something that's defined in a certain time and place by a certain people and then exported elsewhere. But once it's defined, it seems that the whole world is on that same track. It's fast. I mean, I've had the experience of traveling to different regions where people and speaking to people who see themselves on the same track but as behind. That's how they view it. In other words, I think it's easy for take to granted as Americans that well, I'm not sure if there's an appreciation that just just as that, for example, people can view themselves as backward. I've had that experience, for example, in certain regions where people will say, "How do we look to you? To you, do we look backward? I mean, how backward are we compared to other places you visited?" I've actually had that asked of me in certain places. So this sense that there's a linear progression and that you're either behind or ahead, or where you are in that progression is felt very deeply, and it comes from this sense of this definition of modernity as conceived in to a large degree Europe, but also in the United States, really. And these entail, first of all, the ideal of the nation state, where there's a citizenry. The nation state, which consists of a citizenry with elected officials, as opposed to just an elite class that and a fiefdom of people who are so there's just the idea of being a citizen of a state. This is a modern idea. The ideals of reason and progress in the modern sense that things are kind of headed toward a better future. And this would also let this idea that the whole world is on the same track, headed using reason and heading and making progress, and that this is sort of a human endeavor, would lend itself, of course, to imperialism as a civilizing mission. So then all of a sudden you have the ideal, these notions that peoples elsewhere are on the same track, but that they're behind. They don't have democracy. They don't have freedom. They don't have the same rights, universal human rights. And so then the mission becomes to bring these things to these people. And this is the dynamic that was set in the 18th, 19th century and that still persists in some ways. Just to give you an example, this is I just excerpted this is from Napoleon's decree to the Egyptians. So this is a letter he had sent out to be read at the town squares. So this is Napoleon now. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, there is no God but God. So he starts out with the Muslim Shahada. So it's so the French they knew what they were doing. There wasn't for lack of in some ways, the American attempts to engage the Muslim world. It's these attempts are old and they've got a long legacy, and you have all manner of modern imperialists imperialists doing this. It has been said to you that I have only come to this country in order to destroy your religion. This is a clear lie. Do not believe it. I worship God, may he be exalted, and respect his prophet and the glorious Quran. This is, by the way, was written in Arabic, so Napoleon had it translated into Arabic when it was read. O sheikhs, judges, and imams, officers and notables of the town, tell your people that the French are also sincere Muslims. All people are equal in the eyes of God. The only circumstances which distinguish one from the other are reason, virtue, and knowledge. So you see here that the appeal is that we're all, all of us are believers. The French Enlightenment is going to bring to the Muslims these ideals of reason, virtue, and knowledge, and they're going to set the people free from the shackles of at that time, the Turkish, the Ottoman Empire, which Napoleon presents as backward. So, when I guess what I'm getting at here is that when the United States comes with its promises to places like Afghanistan and Iraq, there's a cultural memory of such promises being made all the way back to the 18th century that needs to be understood to contextualize how such frameworks are understood. So in light of this, the experience of being colonized, the question really that the Muslim intellectual elites ask themselves, and this is explicit in their writings, and I'm talking about at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, in the central Islamic lands, as well as Afghanistan and the subcontinent, i.e., what was to become India and Pakistan. The question asked is, what is the cause of our current inferiority, and how can we address it? Now, I'm obviously going to cover a lot of ground here in just a few minutes, but so I'm going to once again sacrifice specificity and details in exchange for clarity, but I'm going to break this down schematically into three types of responses. Reformist Salafis, Wahhabis or Wahhabi Salafis, and militants or jihadists. So first of all, what do we mean by Salafi? Well, the word Salaf comes from one of the words for pious ancestors. So the Salaf are those who take a return to the pious ancestors, that is, the companions of the Prophet, Abu Bakr, Abu Huraira, Aisha, that Omar, Uthman, all those figures who we talked about before in the Sunni isnads. They take their model as the model for what to do. Now you may say to yourself, this sounds a lot like how I described certain aspects of classical Sunnism, and it does share features with classical Sunnism, but the difference is in between the early 9th century and the 18th century, that model had been developed by the jurists, the scholars of Islamic law, and included a great many commentaries and sort of highly developed juristic thought on those materials. And the idea of the Salafis was to cut all that out, to sort of go back to the origins. And so because of that, sometimes scholars from the West have used the word fundamentalist for that, because in some ways it is similar to the Protestant fundamentalists of going back to the roots, going back to the Bible. So just as the Protestant ideal going back to the Bible and cutting out intermediaries, so too do the Salafists say that we should go back to the Quran, go back to the foundations, go back to the pious ancestors. So in a certain sense, it's a post-madhab, a post-school framework. And the idea is to transcend these schools' geographic and social boundaries to instill a sort of sense, once again, in the Ummah, based on the model of the Prophet and the companions, to go back to the Hadith and to purify the religion from unwanted pollutions that have crept in, both well, of different types, which I'm going to talk about. But primarily in the early period, they were concerned with Sufi pollution. And then it stretched to Western pollution and Shiite pollution and superstitions. So just to give you a little bit of, to locate this with a few figures, the thought I'm going to be speaking about comes from really three generations of thinkers, and I'm going to pinpoint these three as extremely influential: Jamaluddin al-Afghani, Muhammad Abdu, Rashid Ridda. Afghani was in Afghanistan, Muhammad Abdu in Egypt, and Rashid Ridda in Syria. And they were, and it's hard to come up with the correct term. I mean, liberal, I'd call it liberal Salafism or Islamic modernism. Whatever helps you, you'll hear their content and you can decide for yourself how you want to, what you want to call it. But the key here is that they were, this was a group of thinkers who wanted to go back to the roots, to go back to the fundamentals in order to bring Islam, to catch Islam up with the competition, and to set it right from its decline. And they used that kind of language. And for them, part of this entailed going back to using one's intellect, ijtihad, on the sources. So these thinkers, it's not like how I talked about the Hanbali school or the Hadith people who are sort of focused on traditions exclusively. The idea is one use one's intellect and get out of the blind imitation of the previous jurists and make Islam relevant for the modern period to help it catch up with the West. And the other thing I put on this slide are the Muslim Brotherhood and effectively Muslim Sisterhood organizations. So the most effective thing really that these thinkers did, in particular Abdu and Ridda, is get heavily invested. The other major figure here I didn't put on the slide is Hassan al-Banna, but is invest themselves in social transformation. And so the Muslim Brotherhood and the Muslim Sisterhood, these organizations had profound effects on particularly Egyptian society. So it was both my point is that these aren't thinkers, writing books. They're also activists. Well, they're also engaged in social transformation on the ground. A little bit parallel to, I don't know if y'all are too young to remember this, but we had the Christian Coalition in the 90s, Jerry Falwell. We have similar groups to this today, of basically a sort of some combination of social network and here it's of course a political has political consequence. In most towns and places in Egypt, there haven't been free elections, so they're apolitical parties, but nevertheless they're engaged in transforming society. So first of all, someone like Afghani wrote that he conceived of the Islamic Ummah as a civilization in the modern European sense, and he really was engaged with European historians on this topic in the late 19th century, so that you had these European historians who were talking about French civilization as a key for the French citizenry and maintaining it. And Ridda basically located, Afghani basically located the parallel with that with Islamic civilization. And he called for a reformation in the Christian sense of the term, like Luther. In other words, he said that we need a transformation, a reformation, to bring Islam up with the modern period. I'm always kind of struck when a lot of political commentators in the U.S., like Thomas Friedman, who writes in the New York Times, calling for saying that Islam never had a reformation, as if he was the one who came up with the idea, when it's been Muslims themselves for over a century have been saying the same thing and have been actually involved in a type of reformation. So it's not that Islam never had a reformation; it did. It just aspects of it didn't turn out in ways that people in the West and people like Thomas Friedman in the globalized West are happy about. So just to channel these thinkers, they argue that Islam is compatible with reason and science. and again, they're taking on the European historians when they make this case that says that imply that these Semitic peoples, which is kind of in the 19th century, Europeans didn't talk about Islam. They talked about Mohammedanism, and they didn't talk about it as a civilization. They talked about the Semites, and there was an argument by Renaud, a famous historian, who argued that the nature of the Semitic peoples is they are frozen in a certain place in their developments, and so they needed to be civilized by the French. So Afghani and Ridda to some extent and Abdu are taking this on. So Islam is compatible with reason and science, and it can be modern. And so part of this is a redefinition or an emphasis on aspects of the tradition that they're finding, such as this verse of Quran 13:10. God changes not what is in a people until they change what is in themselves. So, Islam means activity. It means being actively applying one's intellect to the sources. Again, ijtihad. And there had been a sense among the jurists, there was an argument among the medieval Muslim jurists that the gate of ijtihad had closed. In other words, it was no longer necessary to apply one's intellect to sources independently. One could build one's arguments on the decisions of prior jurists. The reformers called to break this open and said we have to go back to ijtihad on the sources, on the Nas sources, the Quran and the Sunnah through the Hadith. So we return to the teachings of the Prophet. So you can see again, the corollary with Christian fundamentalism in some ways. They argued, moreover, that Christian countries became strong because of the Christianization of the Roman Empire by the emperor. And as a corollary, they say, Muslims grew weak because of corruption and the end of the caliphate and the deviation that came from that. So there's a call really for, again, the Islamic Ummah to reconstitute itself under a caliph. And there are disagreements on what form that should take, whether it should be state by state or all as in, one big caliphate. But, this is, again, coming in the context of European, when the European colonies are still up and running. So there's a call to go back to an indigenous polity. And this is Rashid Ridda. The true Islam values reason and revelation together. So we go back and apply ijtihad to the teachings of the Salaf, of the ancestors, against the pollution that had come in from the Sufi saints and the blind imitation of the ulama. So there's a sense we should open up law based on the general welfare, the maslaha, which you can translate as general welfare for the good of society, and a real importance on general education. So it's not just the scholars who should be educated; it should be the whole populace, including the women. So you can see why one can call this a modernizing Salafism. The idea of it's in a sense it's finding it's determining that the Quran and the Sunnah is consonant with modern values of progress. Well, they didn't use the word progress, but modern values of egalitarianism, general education, reason, and finding it in the sources. Again, just to emphasize this, according to Ridda, now we're up to Ridda, the reasons for the backwardness are the Sufi pollution. So Sufism is basically popular piety, at least according to Ridda. So the Sufis would worship, for example, the shrines of their heroes, of saints who they thought had special charisma, and reformers like Abdu and Ridda and other Salafis find this backward, or even in the case of the Wahhabis, we're coming to soon as shirk, as a type of polytheism. So part of the reason for our backwardness is this type of pollution of kind of magical thinking and a lack of positive activity and unity, ignoring the teachings of the ancestors in the Quran, and just general stagnation and imitation of the ulama who preceded the past generations. So we have to go back to the sources. So to combat the sense, what is required is active work by scholars and intellectuals in particular to educate the population um, on the teachings of the Salaf, and to bring these teachings in light of the modern tradition through ijtihad. They believe that they should write accessible law books, and this people actually did, and you can find them in bookstores in translation now up to today. Um, so the idea is that, not just the scholars and the imams, the leaders of the community, but rather just every Muslim should be educated. And this is again, Rida believed that jihad was to defend Islam from the colonizers, but he said it's no longer necessary to spread it through jihad. And he saw the caliph, and this is quite interesting, as the new caliph should be a supreme mujtahid. Mujtahid is a word for jurist, so a grand jurist. What's interesting about this is that I don't know of any Sunnis in the modern period, any Sunni who made that claim, who used that language and declared himself a caliph. So this is the model that was never enacted, including the Islamic State. I don't think they're using the word mujtahid in other words, Baghdadi is not the head of the Islamic State, of the guy who claims to be the caliph today. Does not claim himself to be mujtahid, but the people who did take this model are is the Iranian Revolution, the mullahs in Iran. So Khomeini, as the source of the revolution I talked about last time, did claim to be the supreme mujtahid. So I'm not sure if there's any connection there, but I thought I'd mention it. And again, this is Rashid Rida. He called for the restoration of the caliphate to protect Muslims against foreign invaders and the application of the law. I should point out this was never heeded in terms that he would have approved of, and I'm quite sure that the likes of Rashid Rida would not have approved of the Islamic State's version of this. Although I guess I shouldn't speak for an historical figure, but from what I see, this is not. It's clear the Islamic State is not coming from a liberal Salafi tradition. In any case. He also called for educational institutions to train these mujtahids and also to train the general population. And again, the Muslim Brotherhood is one expression of this. So the Muslim Brotherhood, which was founded in 1928, their focus was on, they started out really as they were meant to be both an educational but also a political institution. With the ideal of transforming society in an Islamic model. However, after the Free Officers' Revolt in Egypt, these types of political parties were made illegal, and so the Muslim Brotherhood was depoliticized in 1954 and focused primarily on just transforming society through education. This, of course, all changed with the Arab Spring. And the Freedom and Justice Party ran in elections and got 40% of the seats and the most, and won, and assumed power, but was eventually toppled by the same, a faction that had been part of the Mubarak administration in a kind of army revolt, in I believe 2014. So. And really now the Muslim Brotherhood has been even as a social institution there's been such a crackdown that it's been basically sort of the Sisi government has turned it into what he calls a terrorist organization. I mean, it has the status of a terrorist organization in Egypt now, and they've just been doing mass arrests and cracking down on any kind of independent civil liberties. So things are quite bleak for the Muslim Brotherhood at the moment, and they've been made almost totally irrelevant. So there are a few figures who continue to live in places like Turkey and the United States, and but they have so little relevance with the youth on the ground. In the age of kind of more militant, the rise of militancy and the crackdown of the states, that sadly the sort of right now the state of liberal Salafis is kind of beleaguered. But I think that they are, in my humble opinion, the hope for the future of having a stable state, but in places like Egypt. But it's uncertain. Well, yeah. it doesn't look very good for them right now. I want to say a few words on what the scholars, Western scholars, refer to as Wahhabism, which is really another strand of Islamism that has some overlap but has a different genesis from the ones I've just been speaking about, the Afghani, Abdu, Ridda triad. This movement sprang up in the Gulf of Arabia under a figure named Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who died in 1792. He was an admirer of Ibn Taymiyyah, who was a Hanbali scholar who focused on focused on, in a way, renewing the Hanbali tradition to a strict focus on the Quran and the Sunnah and the teachings of Ibn Hanbal himself, the founder of the law school. And one of the things that's characterized by Ibn Taymiyyah is characterized by is a real focus again on the Sufi against innovation, bid'ah, and a condemnation of Sufis and their activities as polytheism, shirk, which is a very I guess I'll use the word extreme charge. So in other words, it's really saying, I mean, shirk, again, as we talked about in the Quran, is basically recognizing something that's not God as God, and it's one of the the real big no-nos in the Islamic tradition. So if you say someone is doing shirk, you really have a responsibility to shut it down, and that's what Wahhabism really is, quite an aggressive, and I think I will use the word, again, extreme version of Islam that really extreme for its intolerance against deviant views. So you have, for example, Wahhabis will destroy saints' tombs. This destruction of these counter traditions that they disagree with. And this might have been a rather obscure, small movement, except that they successfully linked up with the Saud family and formed the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the modern kingdom, or would become the modern kingdom, quite early. And then of course there's the discovery of petroleum in the Gulf in the late 60s and 70s, and so you have this fairly extreme version of Islam being extremely well funded and then spreading itself all over the Middle East and the Islamic world, and to Muslims everywhere. So and that's kind of what the state we're in today, or at least the Wahhabi influence on and frame and the sort of competition over the voices in the public sphere, and the success of the Saudis in dominating them has really been had a profound impact in the different and put the Wahhabi voice as kind of first and foremost in the post-colonial voices, much to the chagrin of many other competitors for that Islamic space. So with that, I want to take you to the Yusuf al-Qaradawi fatwa that we never got to talk about before. And remember, this was the fatwa. Fatwa, as you recall, is an answer to a legal question, and the question was brought by an American Muslim soldier about whether it was licit for him to participate in the Gulf War, the war in Afghanistan. And this was just after 9/11, because he would probably be in a position where he would be being asked to kill other Muslims. And so he asked his Muslim chaplain, who referred it to a larger body, who referred it in turn to fatwa after fatwa after fatwa, until it goes up to this very important Egyptian Salafi scholar, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who had a think tank, had sort of a Islamic organization in Qatar. And he's very well respected, and he continues to be. And he's he's really a Salafi in the Muslim Brotherhood tradition. He was a rector at the Muslim Brotherhood until he left there because he thought they were being too influenced by the state. So he has a very high standing, and he got a group together of Salafis of different types, some of them independent, and issued a fatwa, which I assigned to you, which was the first couple pages, the second and third pages of that article by Bashir Nafi. And basically he argued that, first of all, the answer is yes, you may serve. And the answer, and what he said was, what they argued was that the perpetrators of 9/11 were guilty of a had crime. Remember, we had the had crimes in the Islamic law section. These are the crimes that are infractions against God, and so it's incumbent upon the caliph to carry them out. And so the had crime they charged the 9/11 perpetrators was, remember, the highway excuse me, highway robbery. So it's, they said that it's equivalent to highway robbery. And so what the Qaradawi group argued was that if it was their intention their intention should be, when they're fighting, to carry out the had crime on behalf of God. And but what was interesting is, in the midst of the fatwa, they're basically recognizing the U.S. government and the law of the land that the Muslims are living in as legitimate, which is kind of not that's not part of the Islamic legal framework, the classical legal framework. And you can see, if you read the second half of the article, some of the critics, the Salafi critics of the article, say that they draw on some classical models of thinking, where one should distance oneself from non-Muslims and ally oneself with Muslims to criticize the Qaradawi fatwa. So you have this kind of conversation going on within the Islamist circles, and sort of counter fatwas being issued just after 9/11, which is interesting. So I'm going to ask a discussion question, one discussion question based on the Qaradawi fatwa, and that's going to be one of your exam possibilities. And I'll be posting that in a few minutes. And for the other discussion question, and the way I want to think about the appeal of militant Islam and the the jihadists, is through the novel, rather than kind of teach you a separate section on militancy, and because there's other courses where you can get that in international studies, as far as I'm concerned. Because again, I don't see these militants. I mean, they're not, in my humble opinion, operating in the kind of a classical traditional Islamic framework. They're drawing on these concepts, but it's really more of the geopolitics of the contemporary period that I think that they should be studied in something like an international studies course or political science course, again, in my humble opinion. But what I am interested in is the appeal as presented by someone from the society. So one of the way, that's not the only way to read a novel, but another one is the novel of Yaqubian Building. But one of the ways is just to ask, what's the sort of social situation, what's the social fabric which leads to Taha joining this militant group. And so, I want you to think about, how is the militant group portrayed, and what's the nature of their appeal, at least in the eyes of al-Aswani's imagination. So that's the other discussion question. And what I'm going to ask, and I think what I'm going to have you do, is you can decide which one you want to answer. I'm going to be posting, and you can speak to either of these. So that's it for today, for the lecture for today.